Welcome to The Explainer. Let's jump right into a really fascinating political paradox happening right now. We're looking at Ireland, a famously progressive nation, and how it's currently navigating a rising political undercurrent that totally challenges its global reputation. Over the last decade or so, we've all watched right-wing populism sweep across Europe and the US. And honestly, it brings up a huge question. Is any European country actually immune to this far-right wave? For the longest time, a lot of people just assumed Ireland was the ultimate exception to the rule.
And, well, there was a really good reason for that assumption. Back in 2018, a massive 85% of the Irish public believed EU membership was a good thing. That is a record high. But this stat perfectly sets up the paradox we're digging into today. How is a country that's so overwhelmingly open and pro-European suddenly find itself grappling with anti-immigrant protests and far-right rhetoric?
To understand this shift, let's look at the foundation in Section 1, the Irish exception, focusing on its pro-EU and pro-immigration history. You see, there's always been this deep historical divergence between Ireland and its closest neighbor. While the UK has historically leaned into Euroscepticism, viewing the EU as a loss of sovereignty, the Republic of Ireland has been incredibly Euro-optimist ever since joining back in 1973. They've really seen the EU as this powerful engine for economic and social modernization. Because of that optimism, for decades, the space for any kind of alternative anti-EU or anti-immigration narrative, it just couldn't take root in the moderate center ground of Irish politics. But as we know, even the strongest foundations can crack under pressure. That brings us to Section 2, Cracks in the Foundation, examining the perfect storm of domestic crises. Right now, a literal perfect storm of severe socioeconomic issues is converging. Take housing. We're talking continental high rents and very visible tent encampments in major cities. For a lot of young people, homeownership is basically just a fantasy at this point. Then look at healthcare. Emergency departments are being described as war zones, with reports of wait times hitting 15 hours. Now combine these domestic issues with a massive spike in immigration. Driven largely by the war in Ukraine and broader European trends, Ireland is currently housing roughly 74,000 asylum applicants. To put that in perspective, that's a huge jump from just 7,500 the year prior. So these are very real, very pressing, everyday crises. And all these converging crises have created what analysts are calling a political vacuum. The traditional political duopoly, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, is increasingly seen by frustrated voters as just failing to resolve these fundamental issues. At the same time, the main opposition, Sinn Féin, is viewed by some as kind of trapped, caught between its radical heritage and more cautious center ambitions. So what you get is young professionals locked out of housing, overwhelmed hospitals, and a really deep frustration over what feels like a completely broken social contract. Mainstream parties have essentially left a void, and, well, history tells us that fringe groups are absolutely always eager to exploit a vacuum. Which brings us directly to Section 3, Enter the Far Right, and how fringe players are actively exploiting these grievances. A fascinating 2023 academic study from the Geographical Society of Ireland actually analyzed how right-wing groups are operating online. What they found is that parties like the Irish Freedom Party and the National Party are super active on social media. They're strategically weaponizing what researchers call geopolitical imaginaries, basically inventing exaggerated threats about borders and national identity just to stoke fear. They push this strict Ireland for the Irish narrative, trying to frame the complex socioeconomic issues we just talked about as the direct fault of immigration and a corrupt political establishment. So how exactly are they pulling this off? Well, sources report they are quite literally importing a playbook. Observers note that Irish fringe groups are copying tactics directly from the UK far right, groups like the Patriotic Alternative. They've welcomed controversial British agitators like Tommy Robinson over to Ireland. They relentlessly push this narrative warning of unvetted males. They spread online disinformation about crime, and they promote that extremist Great Replacement theory. It's wholesale importation of culture war rhetoric. And honestly, this leads to a pretty glaring irony. So-called Irish nationalists are out there using imported British extremist tactics to fuel their own movement. Analysts are quick to point out the deep contradiction here. Irish fringe groups, who frequently drape themselves in the history of Irish independence, are actively allying with and mimicking UK extremist movements that literally dream of a reincarnated British Empire. It's wild. This brings us to the core analysis of our explainer, Section 4, the missing leader. If the socio-economic conditions are so ripe, why hasn't this movement just exploded? The answer, according to cultural and textual analyst James O'Sullivan, is summed up perfectly right here. He writes, "The only thing that has saved Ireland from following the international trend towards fascism is competent leadership." O'Sullivan's whole thesis is that the Irish far right's absolute biggest obstacle to mainstream success right now is, well, itself. To put it a bit more colorfully, O'Sullivan notes, Ireland's current far-right leaders aren't Mussolini's or Maloney's, they're more Father Ted than Führer. It's a vivid image, right? But it really illustrates how analysts view these current fringe leaders. They're seen as bumbling, disorganized internet loudmouths who just completely lack the political sophistication you'd need to actually build a massive movement. And the data completely backs this up. We're seeing dismal electoral results, with fringe candidates routinely polling at less than 1% in their constituencies. There's endless factional infighting and party splits. You see this constant tendency to veer away from actual coherent policy and dive headfirst into bizarre, imported conspiracy theories about 5G or Bill Gates. And, honestly, my personal favorite example of missing the cultural mark, organizing rallies in Cork that clash directly with the Munster hurling final. They've just totally failed to build a viable, disciplined coalition.
But analysts warn that just laughing at this incompetence is a really dangerous mistake. Let's move to Section 5. What happens next? A warning for the future.
Here is the ominous pivot. As O'Sullivan warns, and sooner or later, someone will come along who's not a clown. This is the fundamental question. What happens to Irish democracy when a charismatic, politically savvy leader emerges? Someone who can actually unite these fractured, completely legitimate grievances.
We actually don't even have to guess, because there's a well-worn historical playbook for mainstream extremism that we've seen work perfectly in places like France, Italy, and Sweden. It happens in steps. Step 1, professionalize operations. Hire PR firms, put on suits. Step 2, moderate the public image and steer clear of overt racism. Step 3, wrap xenophobia in economic populism. Call it common sense or protecting the vulnerable. And Step 4, unite desperate, frustrated voters under one disciplined banner. This is the exact detoxification process that turns fringe groups into parliamentary kingmakers.
And who exactly are the vulnerable targets a clever operator would try to unite? Well, young people completely locked out of the housing market, rural communities feeling totally left behind, working-class areas that are currently housing hastily assembled asylum centers, and middle-class voters who are just deeply frustrated with government incompetence regarding basic services. A highly competent demagogue wouldn't even need to mention race. They would just frame this exclusion as patriotism, harnessing real economic anxiety to build serious power. So, the absolutely crucial takeaway from this explainer is this. The current incompetence of extremist leaders has given Ireland a reprieve, not immunity. This delay, it's not a permanent shield. The underlying conditions, the housing crisis, the terrible healthcare delays, they're entirely real and they remain completely unaddressed.
Which leaves us with this final, really thought-provoking question. Will robust policy changes address the root grievances first, or is Ireland simply waiting for its own charismatic extremist leader to arrive? Can the state actually fix this broken social contract before a competent, highly organized operator steps in to harness the public's legitimate anger? That is the high-stakes race currently underway. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped you unpack the incredibly complex dynamics at play right now.